The bear begged for shelter from the cold. What happens next will leave you speechless. The bitter winds of the Alaskan wilderness screamed across the rugged, snow-covered terrain, biting through every layer of warmth. The sky was an endless sheet of gray, with the sun's pale light barely breaking through the thick clouds, casting everything in a cold, ethereal hue. The forest stood still, its towering pine trees weighed down by the heavy, unrelenting snow. Every gust of wind carried the scent of pine and ice, mingling with the faint smell of wood smoke from the lone cabin nestled within the woods. Ethan Matthews was no stranger to solitude. A man in his late 30s, he had long abandoned the chaos of city life for the untouched tranquility of the wild. Once a renowned wildlife photographer, Ethan had traveled the world capturing moments of beauty in the most remote corners of the earth. But after the death of his wife, he sought solace in isolation, retreating to the wild to escape the suffocating grief that clung to him like a shadow. Every morning, he woke at dawn, the cold biting at his exposed skin as he stepped outside to gather firewood. His cabin, humble yet comforting, was tucked away from the nearest town, its logs thick enough to withstand even the harshest storms. The only sounds that ever filled the air were the howls of wolves in the distance, the rustle of snow beneath his boots, and the crackle of his fire. But as Ethan stood outside, his breath fogging in the icy air, something didn't feel right. The silence of the forest was thicker than usual, as if the world was holding its breath. It was the calm before the storm, he could feel it in his bones. The snowstorm hit without warning. Ethan had only stepped out for a quick check on his traps, expecting nothing more than a few quiet hours alone. But as he walked along the snow-packed trail, the wind shifted. The gentle breeze turned into a furious gust that whipped through the trees, snapping branches in its wake. The temperature plummeted further, and soon, the quiet forest was alive with the sound of howling wind and swirling snow. Ethan pulled his coat tighter around his body, his hands numbing from the cold. He was no stranger to storms, but this one felt different, unnervingly fierce. His instincts told him to head back to the cabin and wait out the storm, but as he glanced toward the horizon, he saw something that made his heart drop. A figure, barely visible in the distance, stumbled through the snow. It was large, dark, and moving erratically, as if caught in the storm's unforgiving grasp. Ethan squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. And then it clicked. A bear. A mother, he realized, moving with desperation, her large frame struggling against the storm. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, labored, and she was dragging something behind her, a smaller form, something that wasn't moving. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew the forest. He knew the dangers of winter, the risks that wild animals faced. A mother bear wouldn't be out in the open like this unless she had no choice. But what about her cubs? And what was wrong with the one she was dragging? Without thinking, Ethan's feet moved, crunching through the thick snow, the urgency of the moment propelling him forward. The wind howled louder, and he struggled to keep his footing, but he pressed on, the figure of the bear growing closer. His heart raced, but there was no time to panic. The closer he got, the more he could see the severity of the situation. The mother bear's fur was matted with snow and blood, her once majestic body now weary and stumbling. Her eyes were wide, filled with pain and fear. The smaller form she was dragging, a cub, was lifeless, barely clinging to the mother's side, its body limp and covered in blood. Ethan's breath hitched. The storm had turned the forest into a hell's cape, and here, in the middle of it, was a mother fighting with every ounce of her strength to keep her cubs alive. He couldn't just stand by and watch. But as he approached, the bear turned, eyes wild with panic, and gave a low growl, a warning that made Ethan stop dead in his tracks. She wasn't a threat. Not really. But she was protecting her cubs, and any attempt to get too close could set her off. He hesitated, torn between his desire to help and the knowledge that the bear could kill him in seconds if she felt cornered. Ethan's heart ached as he looked at the other cubs, huddled close to their mother, trembling with cold and fear. One cub was still alive, its small body shaking uncontrollably as it clung to the mother's side. But the other, the one she had been dragging, was barely moving. It was a heartbreaking sight, one that pushed Ethan into action. "Hey there," Ethan whispered softly, taking a cautious step forward. He kept his movements slow, steady, not wanting to alarm the mother bear. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into his pack, pulling out a few scraps of food. The bear eyed him warily, her breathing ragged, but she didn't move. The storm was growing worse, and Ethan knew the mother wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions, especially with her cubs in such distress. Ethan carefully stepped forward, his heart pounding. He kept his eyes on the mother bear, watching her every movement, every twitch. The cubs were in trouble. Real trouble. They needed warmth. They needed shelter. And they needed food. And Ethan was the only one here. He didn't think twice about the risks as he knelt beside the fallen cub. He reached out gently, his fingers brushing the cold fur. The cub was freezing, its fur matted with snow and ice, its tiny body barely alive. It was struggling to breathe, each exhale shallow and ragged. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized the magnitude of the situation. If he didn't do something now, the cub wouldn't make it. The storm was getting worse. The wind screamed through the trees, and the temperature dropped even further. He had to make a decision. And he had to make it quickly. The cub needed shelter. The mother bear was too weak to move far, and the rest of the family was on the brink of collapse. Ethan knew what he had to do. "Come on," he murmured, his voice low and steady. "We're going to get you out of here." Ethan gently scooped the cub into his arms, careful not to alarm the mother. The bear watched him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else, something akin to hope. Her cubs were everything to her, and for a moment, it felt as though she was trusting Ethan with their lives. With the cub in his arms, Ethan turned and began to make his way back toward the cabin. He could feel the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. He was risking everything, his life, his safety, and the fragile bond between himself and the wild. But there was no time to waste. The storm was relentless, and the cub couldn't survive out here much longer. The journey back to the cabin was long, the wind biting at Ethan's exposed skin, the snow swirling around him in a frenzy. His boots sank deep into the snow with every step, but he kept moving, his heart racing. Every few steps, he would glance back at the bear, who followed him at a distance, keeping her remaining cubs close. She was slow, exhausted, but she wasn't giving up. Her maternal instinct drove her forward, her determination to protect her family burning brighter than ever. As they reached the cabin, the storm reached its peak, the winds howling with such force that Ethan feared the roof might cave in. He didn't stop. With the cub still in his arms, he rushed inside, dropping to his knees in front of the fire. His hands shook as he placed the cub near the warmth of the flames, quickly starting a new fire to ensure it would survive the cold. The cabin was small, but it was warm and safe. Ethan worked quickly, wrapping the cub in a blanket, trying to warm its frozen body. He didn't know what else to do. He had no training in animal care, no experience with rescuing bears. But instinct told him to do whatever it took to keep the cub alive. Outside, the storm raged on. The mother bear stood in the doorway, her eyes locked onto Ethan, watching him with quiet intensity. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Her cubs were safe now. The immediate danger was over, and it was all thanks to Ethan's intervention. But deep down, Ethan knew this wasn't truly over. The mother bear wasn't just a wild animal, she was a creature driven by survival, by love, and by the need to protect her young. The storm outside would eventually pass, but the real challenge was only just beginning. Ethan sat back, exhausted, his eyes drifting to the window. He couldn't stop thinking about the bear, the trust she had placed in him, and the responsibility he now carried. What would happen when the storm cleared? Would the bear trust him enough to leave her cub behind? Would she see him as a friend or a threat? The tension in the air was palpable as the storm continued to howl outside. Ethan realized that his connection with the wild had just become much deeper, much more complicated. He had made a choice to intervene, but what would be the price of that choice? The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the small, cramped cabin. Ethan sat by the fire, his hands still trembling from the cold and the sheer intensity of the storm. He had done everything he could for the bear cub, the one he had risked his life for, and now, all he could do was wait. The cub lay nestled in the blanket, its breathing slow but steady, the warmth from the fire gradually bringing some color back to its pale face. Outside, the storm howled with a ferocity that left Ethan feeling isolated, trapped in this tiny cabin with no escape. His mind raced. The mother bear was still out there, standing guard at the door. She had not moved since he had brought the cub inside. Her presence was a heavy weight pressing down on his chest, as if she were waiting for something, waiting for him to make a decision. Ethan hadn't expected any of this. His life had been simple and solitary up until now. He had come to the wilderness to escape, to grieve, to find peace. But this was a complication he hadn't prepared for. A mother bear and her cubs, depending on him, looking to him for guidance and protection. And that terrified him. What have I gotten myself into? He thought as he stared into the fire, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had saved the cub, but what about the rest of the family? What would he do when the storm passed? The bear had followed him inside, her eyes never leaving him. Ethan could feel her gaze even now, burning into the back of his neck. He glanced at the cub again. The little thing was still breathing, but it was weak. Ethan could hear the soft, labored breaths, each one a reminder of how close to death it had come. The bear's desperation had been palpable. And now, that desperation was his responsibility. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts clouding with uncertainty. Should I let them stay? He wondered. Should I keep them safe, sheltered in here with me? But the reality of the situation kept creeping back in. Ethan knew he wasn't a doctor. He wasn't equipped to care for a bear, let alone a mother and her cubs. What if they stayed? What if they attacked me? What if I couldn't control them? The fear that had bubbled beneath the surface all along began to overwhelm him. He had already broken one of the most basic survival rules: don't interfere with wild animals. By taking the cub inside, he had crossed a line. What was to stop the mother from attacking him once she realized her cubs were no longer in her care? What would happen if she didn't trust him? If she panicked? And then there was the bigger question: what if keeping them here meant that the wild, the place that had once given him solace, Was lost forever? What if his actions destroyed the very thing he had come to love? The decision seemed impossible. Every instinct in him screamed to send them back into the wild, to send the bear away and hope that it would be enough. He had no right to keep them here, to disrupt the delicate balance of nature. But then again, what was the cost of letting them leave? The cub was barely hanging on. If he didn't act now, it could die in the cold. The mother bear would have to fend for herself, and the other cub might not survive either. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. I can't let them die out there. I can't just send them back into that storm. But the fear gnawed at him. He was not equipped for this. He wasn't a ranger or a wildlife expert. He had no business keeping wild animals in his cabin. The weight of that truth felt like a crushing burden. Yet, as he looked at the mother bear again, standing motionless at the door, Ethan saw something in her eyes that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't anger or hostility. It was trust. She was trusting him with her most precious possession, her cub. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had made the decision to bring the cub inside, to save it from the storm. But now, the stakes had grown higher. This was no longer just about saving a life. It was about whether or not he was willing to face the consequences of his actions. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound. Ethan turned his head slowly. The mother bear had moved closer. Just a few feet away from him now, her eyes locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved. There was no growl. No threat. Just the quiet weight of the moment, the realization that they were both at a crossroads. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His decision could change everything. He could turn them away, watch them disappear into the storm, and leave the cub to die. Or he could break every rule and risk his safety to keep them close. His mind whirled. He thought of his life before the storm, before this moment. The solitude he had so desperately craved now felt suffocating. The wilderness was no longer a place of quiet refuge. It had become a battleground of decisions, of morality, of survival. As he looked into the eyes of the bear, he saw something that sent a shock of clarity through him. She wasn't asking for his help. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She was offering a choice, an unspoken understanding that he had to make a decision. Not just for the cub, but for himself. Ethan's breath slowed as he processed that understanding. The choice wasn't just about the bear or the cub. It was about who he wanted to be in this moment. Did he want to be the man who ran from responsibility, who turned his back on life's messy complications? Or did he want to be the man who chose to stand up, to face the consequences of his actions, and to take responsibility for something greater than himself? His mind quieted as the answer formed within him. I choose to act. The decision made, Ethan stood up slowly, his hands steady now. He walked toward the mother bear, who had not moved. Her eyes followed him as he came closer. Without a word, he reached down and grabbed the rifle from the corner. It was only for protection. The mother bear was close, and there was no telling how she might react. He walked to the door, opened it just enough to step outside and into the fierce storm. The wind hit him like a solid wall, but he pressed on, stepping through the snow as he made his way to the makeshift shelter. His footsteps left deep impressions in the snow, but each step felt like a weight lifted from his chest. When he reached the shelter, Ethan glanced back. The mother bear had not moved. She was still watching him. Waiting. And in that moment, he understood. She trusted him. It was time to take the next step. Time to offer shelter to the family who had come to him for help, whether he was ready for it or not. With a deep breath, Ethan returned inside, closing the door against the blizzard. He turned and faced the bear, her eyes now soft with exhaustion. The cub lay in the blanket by the fire, its breathing a little steadier. Ethan's heart swelled with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. He had chosen to face the storm with them, to do whatever it took to ensure their survival. Ethan walked toward the mother bear, who finally approached him, her head low. She didn't attack. She didn't growl. She simply nudged his hand, seeking his touch. And just like that, Ethan realized the moral dilemma, the decision he had agonized over for so long, had already been made. It wasn't just about saving the cub. It was about embracing the bond between all living creatures, about recognizing the role we play in each other's survival. The fire burned brighter now, and in the flickering light, the tension finally began to fade. The storm outside may have been howling, but inside, for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt at peace. The storm raged for 2 more days, its ferocity undiminished, but inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the quiet companionship of the mother bear and her cubs brought Ethan an unexpected sense of peace. The bears had settled into the small space, the cubs huddling together for warmth, their tiny bodies slowly recovering from the cold and exhaustion. The mother bear, though still visibly weak, seemed to relax, her once tense body now able to breathe freely without the sharp edge of desperation. Ethan had never been so close to wild animals before, not like this. As he spent his days tending to the cubs, making sure they had enough food and warmth, he couldn't help but feel a deep respect for them. The mother bear's silent trust in him, her willingness to let him help her cubs, had shaken something deep within him. For so long, he had kept himself isolated from the world, unwilling to get too close to anyone or anything, afraid of what it might mean to care. But now, in the presence of these wild creatures, he was forced to confront something he had buried for so long, the capacity to feel deeply, to care for something beyond his own pain. Each day, as the storm subsided and the world outside began to thaw, Ethan found himself looking at the bears not as intruders in his life but as a reminder of something beautiful. Their struggle, their resilience, was a reflection of his own journey. They, too, were survivors in a world that could be merciless. And yet, despite the cruelty of nature, there was compassion between them, a bond forged not by words but by silent understanding. The bond was mutual, rooted in a shared struggle for survival. By the time the storm finally cleared, the cabin no longer felt so empty. Ethan's mind and heart had shifted, unknowingly at first. As the bears recovered and grew stronger, he had expected them to leave once the storm had passed, to vanish into the wild where they belonged. But the thought of them leaving, of returning to his former life of solitude, filled him with an unexpected sadness. It was then that the mother bear made a decision of her own. One afternoon, as the sun finally began to break through the clouds, Ethan saw her standing by the door. Her eyes, soft but knowing, lingered on him for a long moment. She didn't growl or whimper, she simply looked, as though saying thank you. Ethan stood silently, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the moment had arrived. The bears were healed, the storm was over, and the time had come for them to leave. But he wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. Something inside him had changed. He had thought that keeping the bears here was a risk, that it would bring danger and complication. But in the end, he realized it had been the right thing to do. It wasn't about the rules of survival anymore. It was about compassion. It was about seeing the world and the creatures in it as more than just a means of survival. It was about connection. The mother bear stepped toward him, her massive frame no longer the figure of desperation it had once been. She walked with the grace of a creature who had been given a second chance, a chance that not all animals would have been granted. She nudged his hand with her nose, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked in an understanding that went beyond words. With one last look at Ethan, the bear turned and walked toward the door. Her cubs followed without hesitation, their movements more confident now, their fur glossy and healthy. Ethan opened the door, stepping aside to let them pass. They walked slowly, carefully, as if not wanting to disturb the peace that had been created in the cabin. The sound of their footsteps crunching in the snow was the only noise as they disappeared into the forest, blending into the wilderness that had once been their only home. Ethan stood there, his heart heavy with the bittersweetness of the moment. He watched as the mother bear and her cubs moved into the trees, their forms fading into the distance. The door remained open for a few moments longer, the cold air rushing in to replace the warmth of their presence. The silence that followed was profound. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't the same peace he had once sought in isolation. This was something different, something born from the connection he had forged with the wild, with the creatures that had come into his life when he least expected it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the snowy landscape, Ethan stood in the doorway, looking out into the vast wilderness. He no longer saw it as something to fear or escape from. Instead, he saw it as something alive, something that demanded respect but also offered beauty, connection, and redemption. Ethan had always believed that life in the wild was about survival. But now, he understood. It was about more than survival. It was about compassion, trust, and the unspoken bond that can exist between humans and the creatures that share this world with us. And in that moment, standing alone in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Ethan knew that his life would never be the same. He was no longer just a man in the wilderness. He was a part of it. The end.